The Man Who Never Lost. The heavy glass doors of Meyer and Hawthorne LP slid shut behind Ethan Graves as he stepped out onto the cold Manhattan street. The city never slept, and neither did he. For 15 years, Ethan had built his career on a single, unshakable principle. Winning was all that mattered. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who fought for justice. He fought to win. Corporations, billionaires, politicians, they all came to him when they had something to protect. And Ethan delivered every single time. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, his sharp blue eyes flicking to his phone as it vibrated in his palm. A message from Norman Adler, his firm's senior partner. The deal is done. Congratulations. Ethan smirked, slipping the phone into his pocket. Another multi-billion-dollar lawsuit crushed before it could ever see a courtroom. Another win added to his flawless record. His driver was already waiting by the curb, standing beside the sleek black Bentley. Ethan barely acknowledged him as he pulled his coat tighter and approached. Then, something unexpected happened. A small figure darted into his path, blocking his way. A boy, no older than 8, with messy brown hair and an oversized jacket that hung off his frail frame. His sneakers were scuffed, his jeans torn. His face, pale and desperate, was smeared with tears. Ethan frowned. He had no time for this. "Move," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. The boy didn't move. Instead, he grabbed Ethan's sleeve and looked up at him with terrified, glassy eyes. Then, in a broken voice, he whispered 4 words. "They're going to kill her." Ethan felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. For the first time in his career, he hesitated. The boy's plea. Ethan glanced around. The street was busy. No one paid attention. People in Manhattan didn't stop for moments like this. He looked back at the boy. "Who are you talking about?" Ethan asked, pulling his arm free. The boy sniffed, his small hands gripping his own sleeves. "My mom." Asterisk, asterisk, his voice cracked. "They said she killed someone, but she didn't. They're trying to make it look like she did." Asterisk, asterisk. Ethan exhaled, already irritated. "Go to the public defender's office." "They don't care," the boy snapped back instantly. That made Ethan pause. Something about the way he said it, so final, so sure, sent an uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. "What's your name, kid?" The boy swallowed, his lip trembling. "Liam," he said. "Liam Carter." Ethan frowned. The name meant nothing to him until Liam choked out the next part. "My mom is Rebecca Carter." Ethan's entire body went still. Rebecca Carter. The woman accused of murdering Simon Vance, a high-profile investor who was found dead in his penthouse 3 weeks ago. The case had been open and shut. The police found Rebecca at the scene. The murder weapon was in her apartment. The prosecution had a slam-dunk conviction lined up. And now, standing before Ethan, was her son, desperate, homeless, and begging for help. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He should walk away. This wasn't his fight. But then Liam reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, the edges worn from being handled too many times. He held it out, his small fingers trembling. "She told me to hide this," Liam whispered, "in case something happened." Ethan took it, unfolded it, and felt his stomach tighten as he read the words written in shaky handwriting. "They set me up." The paper was stained with something dark. Blood. A choice he never had to make. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his case. This wasn't his fight. He had spent his life defending powerful men, not the powerless. But something about this case, it itched at the back of his mind. Rebecca Carter was an ordinary accountant, a single mother with no history of violence. Why would she suddenly snap and murder a billionaire investor? And why was her son, alone on the streets at midnight, so convinced she was innocent? Ethan let out a sharp breath, his gaze locked onto Liam's desperate, pleading eyes. He clenched his jaw, shoving the note into his pocket. "Where are you staying?" Ethan asked. Liam's face crumpled with relief. "Nowhere," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. He was going to regret this. "Come on, kid," he muttered. "Let's go." And for the first time in his career, Ethan Graves was about to take on a case that had nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with the truth. The case no one wanted. Ethan Graves wasn't sure when he had officially lost control of his life. Maybe it was the moment Liam Carter had grabbed his sleeve, desperation in his voice. Maybe it was when Ethan had read the bloodstained note, the rushed handwriting of a woman who had known, without a doubt, that she was being framed. Or maybe it was now, as he sat in his high-rise office, staring at the case files of Rebecca Carter, a woman he had never met, but whose fate was now tangled up in his own. The thick file lay open on his mahogany desk, every page a meticulous, damning piece of evidence. It was clear why the prosecution thought this was an open and shut case. Rebecca had been found in her small apartment, blood on her hands, the murder weapon tucked inside her closet. Security footage from the penthouse building showed her arriving shortly before the murder. Simon Vance's financial records showed recent transactions linked to Rebecca's personal bank account, as though he had been paying her off for something. And most damning of all, a witness, a neighbor, claimed to have heard her arguing with Vance earlier that evening. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent his entire career tearing apart cases like this, on the other side. He had built a legacy ensuring that men like Simon Vance never faced consequences, and yet here he was, about to tear into the prosecution's case instead of defending it. He knew what was happening. He was making a mistake that could ruin everything he had spent 15 years building. He could still back out. He could still return Liam Carter to social services, let Rebecca fade into the system like 1,000 other forgotten defendants. But something gnawed at him. It wasn't just the bloodstained note. It wasn't just the look in Liam's eyes. It was something else. Something about this case felt wrong. Too neat, too clean. He picked up the forensic report and scanned it again. Gunshot residue. Inconclusive. That alone made his gut twist. If Rebecca Carter had fired the weapon, there should have been clear GSR on her hands, her sleeves, or anywhere near her body. The report barely acknowledged this inconsistency, as if the prosecution hadn't even bothered questioning it. Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Norman Adler. He hesitated before answering. "Graves. You're wasting your time." Adler's voice came through, smooth, measured. "I just got word that you're looking into Carter's case. Drop it." Ethan smiled dryly. "And here I thought you'd call to congratulate me on my last win. You don't have the luxury of playing dumb. We both know where your bread is buttered, Ethan. You built your career by knowing when to back off. This is one of those times." Ethan swiveled his chair, staring out the towering windows of his 50th floor office. Manhattan stretched beneath him, glowing with wealth, power, and secrets. "That's funny," he murmured, "because I think this case is just getting interesting." Adler sighed. "Do you have any idea who you're up against? This isn't some petty fraud lawsuit, Ethan. There are people who want this case buried. Rebecca Carter was meant to disappear quietly. You getting involved is a problem." Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. There it was. The confirmation he needed. This wasn't just about Rebecca Carter. Someone, somewhere, wanted her to stay locked away, and fast. He played it cool. "If I were you, Norman, I'd stop telling me what I can and can't do. You don't own me." There was a long silence before Adler's voice turned colder. "Then you'd better be ready to burn for this." The line went dead. Ethan sat back, staring at his phone. He should have been afraid. He should have taken the warning for what it was, a threat from men with money, power, and no hesitation about making people disappear. Instead, he smiled. For the first time in his career, he had something real to fight for. The unraveling truth. By the time Ethan arrived at Rikers Island, the city was shrouded in the dim gray of early evening. The prison loomed before him, cold and indifferent. He had never stepped foot in a place like this before. He had always been the kind of attorney who worked with people who never saw the inside of a jail cell. He was escorted through the sterile, dimly lit corridors until he was seated in the visitation booth, separated by thick plexiglass. Rebecca Carter was already sitting on the other side, her expression unreadable. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes were still sharp. Ethan set his briefcase down. "You don't look like someone who just accepted a guilty plea." Rebecca let out a humorless laugh. "That's because I didn't." "Then why does everyone in the legal system seem to think you did?" "Because they don't care," she said flatly. "They just want this case wrapped up as quickly as possible. I wasn't given a fair trial. My public defender didn't even look at the forensic inconsistencies. The judge barely let me talk." She exhaled sharply. "It's like the whole system decided I was guilty before I even walked into that courtroom." Ethan studied her. He had spent his entire life assessing people, peeling back their lies, their motivations, their weaknesses. Rebecca Carter wasn't lying. She wasn't hiding something. She was defeated. She crossed her arms. "Why are you here, Mr. Graves? People like you don't help people like me." Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Your son came to me." Rebecca stiffened. "He was alone on the streets, begging me to save you. You're all he has left." A flicker of something passed over her face. Guilt, pain, fear. "Liam, he's okay. For now," Ethan said. "But if you go down for this, he's going into the system. You and I both know what happens to kids like him in foster care." Rebecca swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists. "I didn't kill Simon Vance," she whispered. "I don't care what the police report says. I didn't do it." Ethan sat back. "Then who did?" Rebecca exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But I do know one thing. Simon was afraid before he died. He was trying to tell me something about the company. He said he made a mistake. That he got in too deep. The night he died, he called me. Said he needed to show me something." Ethan frowned. "Did he say what?" "No," Rebecca said. "Because by the time I got there, he was already dead." Ethan clenched his jaw. The pieces were starting to come together, but something still didn't make sense. If Simon had been about to expose something, then whoever killed him needed to silence him before he could talk, and they needed a scapegoat. Ethan's instincts were screaming at him now. This wasn't just a murder case. This was something much bigger. He stood. "I'm taking your case." Rebecca stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. "Why?" Ethan didn't know the answer himself. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was Liam's desperate plea. Or maybe, for the first time in his career, he wasn't fighting for money, power, or victory. He was fighting for the truth. The evidence that shouldn't exist. Ethan Graves had handled his fair share of cases, but none had ever felt like this. Sitting in his high-rise office long after midnight, he pored over every detail of the Rebecca Carter case, his fingers flipping through page after page of evidence that felt too perfect, too convenient. The entire case had been wrapped up with a bow, the kind of airtight package that prosecutors loved and defense attorneys feared. But Ethan wasn't just any attorney. He had built his career on finding the cracks in the strongest cases, and this one had cracks that were too well hidden for his liking. The forensic reports bugged him the most. Gunshot residue, inconclusive. That made no sense. If Rebecca had fired the weapon inside the penthouse, the test should have come back positive. There should have been clear evidence of gunpowder on her hands, her sleeves, even in the fibers of her clothing. But instead, the results were dismissed, buried beneath more compelling evidence. More compelling evidence, like the security footage that only showed Rebecca entering the building but conveniently didn't show anyone else who might have been inside at the time of Simon Vance's murder. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years crafting perfect defenses for billion-dollar clients, playing chess against the prosecution, and always winning. But this time, he wasn't playing for a client who could pay for his time. He was playing for a woman who had been chewed up and spit out by the legal system before she even had a chance to fight back. And the worst part, someone wanted this case buried. Fast. The more Ethan thought about it, the more certain he became. Rebecca Carter hadn't just been framed. She had been sacrificed. His computer chimed, pulling him out of his thoughts. Eva, his assistant, and the only person he trusted, had sent him a file dump. The subject line read, "Found something you need to see. Call me." Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed her immediately. She picked up after one ring. "You're working late," he said, keeping his voice light. "So are you," Eva shot back. "You need to open that file right now." Ethan clicked the attachment. As the document loaded, his pulse slowly ticked up. Bank statements, wire transfers, offshore accounts, and one name that shouldn't be here. Norman Adler. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. What am I looking at? Transactions from a shell company linked to Simon Vance's accounts. The same shell company Rebecca flagged at her job a few months ago. The same one that suddenly went quiet after she was arrested. Ethan scrolled through the documents, his eyes locking onto a $2 million transfer, dated the day before Simon Vance's death. The recipient, Adler Holdings. A sick realization settled over Ethan. Adler wasn't just trying to scare me away from this case. He's involved. More than involved, Eva said. I traced a second transfer, $300,000, straight to one of the lead detectives on Rebecca's case. Ethan's stomach turned. You're telling me that the detective in charge of Rebecca's case got paid off. I'm telling you that her conviction wasn't just a mistake, Eva said, her voice tight with anger. It was bought. Ethan let out a slow breath, staring at the glowing cityscape outside his office window. He had known powerful men did terrible things to protect themselves. But this was a whole new level. Rebecca Carter wasn't just a convenient scapegoat. She had stumbled into something big, something Adler and his people needed to keep buried. And Simon Vance. He had known too much. A sudden, uninvited guest. A knock at his office door made Ethan stiffen. It was nearly 2 a.m. No one should be in the building this late. Slowly, he stood, crossing the dimly lit office. He wasn't a paranoid man, but something about the way this case was unfolding made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He opened the door. A man in a dark suit stood there, his expression unreadable. He wasn't security, and he sure as hell wasn't a client. His build was solid, his jaw tight. The kind of man who was used to standing in the background, watching, listening, and handling problems. Mr. Graves, the man said smoothly, we need to talk. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Funny, I was just thinking I'd had enough surprises for tonight. The man didn't smile. It's about your recent interests. Ethan kept his face neutral, but his brain was already working. Adler had sent him. Maybe not personally, but this was a message. Go ahead, Ethan said, feigning boredom. Say what you came to say. The man took a slow step forward. You need to drop the Carter case. Immediately. Ethan smirked, even as his pulse ticked up. That's bold. Usually, people try to brag me first. This isn't about money, Mr. Graves, the man said, voice like steel. It's about survival. You walk away now, and this ends. You keep digging, and you won't like what you find. Ethan studied him, reading between the lines. This wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. A threat wrapped in the polished tone of a man who had made plenty of problems disappear before. He could still walk away. He could pretend none of this ever mattered. But then he thought about Liam. About the way that kid had clutched that crumpled note, believing with every part of his heart that someone would finally fight for him. Ethan stepped closer, his face inches from the man's. Tell your boss, he said quietly, that I don't scare easy. The man studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Suit yourself." Then he turned and walked away. Ethan closed the door, exhaling sharply. He had just officially declared war. The next move. By the time morning arrived, Ethan had already mapped out his next move. If Adler was involved, then he wasn't just protecting a case. He was protecting an entire empire of corruption. Ethan needed proof. He dialed Eva again. "I need you to pull everything on Adler's shell companies." "I already started," Eva replied. "But you're not going to like what I found." "Try me." "Because you're not just up against Adler," Eva said. "He's connected to some very powerful people. Judges, prosecutors, cops. If we do this, we won't be able to stop until we bring down every single one of them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we don't stop." For the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't just playing the game to win. He was about to burn it all down. A game of ghosts. Ethan Graves was no stranger to powerful enemies. He had spent 15 years navigating the corridors of corporate law, where deals were made in hushed voices over mahogany desks and fortunes were secured through carefully manipulated legal loopholes. He had seen men destroy others with nothing more than a signature on a document. He had seen reputations erased overnight and careers built on lies so carefully constructed they might as well have been truths. But this was different. This wasn't a corporate battle over money or a legal maneuver to protect billionaires from accountability. This was corruption at its highest level, and Ethan had just stepped into a war he wasn't supposed to survive. By the time dawn broke over Manhattan, he had barely slept. His office was a mess of files, forensic reports, and printouts of Adler's financial records, spread across the floor like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted solved. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Simon Vance's murder and Rebecca Carter's wrongful conviction were just the tip of the iceberg. Eva had been right. Adler wasn't just covering up a crime. He was protecting something much bigger, something that had been going on for years, maybe even decades. Ethan leaned over his desk, tapping a red marker against a list of names. Every judge, every detective, every prosecutor connected to Rebecca's case had one thing in common: a financial link to Adler Holdings or one of its subsidiaries. He exhaled slowly. The justice system wasn't just corrupt. It was bought and paid for. And now, they knew he was looking. The warning that came too late. His office door swung open without a knock. Eva stood there, her face pale, a manila folder clenched tightly in her hands. Ethan straightened, instantly on alert. "What happened?" "You need to see this," she said, her voice unusually tight. Ethan grabbed the folder and flipped it open. The first thing he saw was a photograph. A body, face down in a pool of blood. A single gunshot wound to the chest. The second thing he saw was the name at the bottom of the report: Detective Owen Marsh. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him. He was the lead detective on Rebecca's case. Eva nodded, and the only one who could have testified that the evidence against her was suspicious. Ethan's fingers clenched the folder. "When did this happen?" "Last night." Eva hesitated. "Right around the time you had your little visitor." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. He had expected intimidation. He had expected bribes, legal threats, maybe even surveillance. But this was murder. They staged it as a mugging, Eva continued. But look at the forensic details. His wallet was untouched. His phone was missing, but there was no forced entry on his car. He wasn't robbed. He was executed. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Because he knew too much." "Because you started digging," Eva corrected. The weight of it settled over him. He had spent his entire life arguing that the law was nothing more than strategy, that truth didn't matter, only the ability to present the stronger case. But now he was standing in the middle of a game that had no rules. He ran a hand over his face. What about his case files? Did he leave anything behind? Eva shook her head. If he had anything, it's gone. His apartment was already searched by NYPD. Unofficially, of course. No warrant, just men who know how to clean up loose ends. Ethan slammed the folder shut. They think they buried this. They think they buried him, Eva corrected. And if we don't move fast, you'll be next. A desperate play. Ethan didn't argue. He just grabbed his coat and his briefcase and headed for the door. Where are we going? Eva asked, falling into step beside him. To see someone who still owes me a favor. It wasn't just anyone. It was Judge Henry Caldwell, a man who had been on the bench for 20 years and who Ethan had once helped out of a very compromising situation. He found Caldwell at a private golf club in Midtown, sipping coffee on the terrace, looking every bit like a man who had never once seen the inside of a courtroom that wasn't under his control. Ethan, Caldwell greeted, setting down his cup. This is a surprise. Ethan didn't sit. He dropped a file onto the table instead. Read it. Caldwell sighed, adjusting his glasses as he flipped open the file. It took exactly 30 seconds before his face changed. His hand tightened around the paper. This, he exhaled. This is serious. No kidding, Ethan said flatly. Caldwell flipped another page, then looked up. And what do you want from me? I need a warrant, Ethan said. I need access to Adler's private records, his corporate transactions, his offshore accounts. Caldwell leaned back, rubbing his jaw. You're asking me to sign my own death certificate. I'm asking you to do the right thing. Caldwell let out a slow breath. You know that's not how the world works. Ethan's jaw tightened. It does today. For a long moment, Caldwell said nothing. Then, finally, he pulled a pen from his pocket, scrawled his signature across a warrant request, and slid it back across the table. Don't ever ask me for another favor, he muttered. Ethan didn't even smile. You won't live long enough to owe me one. He turned and left. The breaking point. By the time Ethan and Eva returned to his office, the warrant had already been processed, which meant that by morning, every financial record Adler had ever tried to bury would be in their hands. But something wasn't right. The moment they stepped off the elevator, Ethan felt it. A shift in the air, an unnatural stillness. Then he saw it. His office door wide open. Papers scattered across the floor. His desk drawers ripped from their hinges. Eva's breath caught. Ethan. He stepped inside, his pulse pounding. His files were gone. His laptop wiped clean. A single note sat on his desk, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Walk away. This is your last chance. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then he slowly picked it up, folded it, and slid it into his pocket. Eva turned to him, her eyes dark with realization. They're watching us. Ethan nodded. They're afraid. They should be. For the first time in his life, Ethan Graves wasn't defending the powerful. He was hunting them down. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The fire that wouldn't die. Ethan Graves stood in the wreckage of his office, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The air still carried the scent of disrupted dust and disturbed paper, the faint hint of cologne that wasn't his lingering like a silent confession that some people, had been here. They had come in fast and precise, just like professionals always did, knowing exactly what they were looking for. And now, everything was gone. The case files, the forensic inconsistencies, the hacked financial records linking Adler to Simon Vance's murder. Every single document that could have exposed the truth had been wiped from existence, as if Ethan had never spent the last week fighting to uncover it. Eva stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression grim. They were careful. No security footage. No fingerprints. Nothing. This wasn't some random scare tactic. They wanted to erase every trace of what you found. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. They had stripped him of evidence, hoping it would end the fight before it could even reach a courtroom. They had made a mistake. They had taken his files, but they hadn't taken his memory. I don't need the documents, he said, turning toward his desk and sweeping the remaining junk aside. I remember everything. The transaction dates, the account numbers, the shell companies. I don't need paper to bring these bastards down. Eva raised an eyebrow. You do realize how insane that sounds, right? We're going up against people who have the power to disappear judges, to buy off entire investigations. You think they're going to let you take this to trial? Ethan smirked. Who said anything about taking it to trial? Eva hesitated. Then what's the plan? He grabbed his coat, his mind already 10 steps ahead. We stopped playing by their rules. Eva stared at him for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. You're going to get yourself killed. Not if I get to them first, he said, and for the first time in his life, he meant it. A dangerous gambit. Ethan had spent years manipulating the system, twisting legal loopholes in favor of the rich and powerful. He knew how they operated, how they buried secrets beneath layers of corporate jargon and offshore bank accounts. But he also knew how to expose them. By morning, he had already put the first phase of his plan into motion. A carefully orchestrated leak had begun to spread. Whispers among journalists, carefully dropped hints in the right circles. The story wasn't public yet, but it would be. And when it was, there would be no containing it. Ethan had personally delivered a file, one he had reconstructed from memory, to a hand-picked investigative journalist, someone he knew wasn't on anyone's payroll, someone who had spent years exposing government corruption and had nothing to lose. Once you break the story, Ethan told him, you'll have every major media outlet breathing down their necks. They won't be able to silence you without making it obvious. The journalist nodded, his fingers tightening around the folder. You do realize this puts you in serious danger. Ethan smirked. I was already in danger the moment I said yes to this case. And he was right. Because that night, they came for him. The attack. The hit came fast, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of the city. Ethan had been waiting for it. He had seen the tail hours ago, 2 unmarked cars following at a careful distance, waiting for the right opportunity. And now, as he stepped out of his apartment building into the cold Manhattan air, that opportunity had come. The black SUV screeched to a halt, doors flying open. 2 men stepped out, no masks. No hesitation. They weren't here to talk. Ethan moved first. He sidestepped the first man, barely avoiding the sudden glint of a knife, and drove his elbow into the attacker's throat. The man gagged, stumbling backward, and Ethan used the moment to grab his wrist and twist. Hard. The knife clattered onto the pavement. The second man lunged. A hard punch caught Ethan in the ribs, sending a sharp burst of pain through his side. But pain was something he had learned to ignore. He grabbed the man's wrist and yanked him forward, using his own momentum to slam him against the hood of the SUV. More footsteps. A third man was coming. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed the fallen knife, turned, and slashed it across the third attacker's arm. The man let out a strangled curse, stumbling back. And then, tires screeched. Eva's car swerved onto the street, headlights blinding the attackers. Get in, she shouted. Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the car, throwing himself into the passenger seat as Eva hit the gas, the car jerking forward just as the attackers regained their footing. Bullets ripped through the back windshield, shattering glass across the dashboard. Eva cursed but kept driving, weaving through traffic with the kind of precision that only pure adrenaline could produce. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping his ribs. You have terrible timing. Eva shot him a glare. You're welcome. They drove in silence for a few minutes before she finally asked, Are you hurt? Ethan flexed his fingers, ignoring the throbbing in his ribs. Not enough to stop. Eva's hands tightened on the wheel. That wasn't just a warning, Ethan. I know. They weren't trying to scare you. They were trying to kill you. Ethan nodded, which means we're getting close. The last stand. By the time they reached a safe house, an old apartment Ethan kept off the books for emergencies, his mind was already racing. The story was out now. He had made sure of it. Within the next 24 hours, the public would know the truth about Adler, about Simon Vance's murder, about the system that had been built to protect the powerful at the expense of the innocent. But they weren't going to wait for the justice system to handle it. No, people like Adler didn't go down without a fight. And if they were willing to kill for silence, then Ethan was willing to fight for the truth. "We need to go after him directly," Eva said, pacing the small apartment. "We can't just let this play out in the news. We need real, undeniable proof." Ethan nodded slowly. "Which means getting into his private financial records. The real ones, not the ones he lets his accountants see." Eva raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "By going straight to the source." For the first time since this had started, he was about to go on the offensive. The beginning of the end. The people who had spent years hiding behind power and influence had finally met someone they couldn't intimidate. Ethan had spent his career winning cases for men like Adler. Now he was going to destroy them. The fall of Titans. Ethan Graves had spent his career defending the untouchable, ensuring the rich and powerful never faced consequences. He had built his name on winning cases that should never have been won, twisting the law until justice became nothing more than a strategic game. Now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't playing defense. He was going to destroy the very system he had once protected. The moment he decided to go after Norman Adler directly, everything changed. This was no longer about Rebecca Carter's wrongful conviction. This was about toppling an empire built on corruption, murder, and money that was never meant to be traced. Ethan sat in the dimly lit safe house, an old laptop in front of him, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Eva sat across from him, arms crossed, watching as he worked. The files they had leaked to the press were already making waves. Social media was exploding with speculation. Journalists were digging deeper, and public interest was rising by the hour. But it wasn't enough. A scandal alone wouldn't bring Adler down. The people who controlled the world didn't fear bad press. They feared exposure that couldn't be ignored. Ethan wasn't looking for dirt. He was looking for proof that would end Adler permanently. "The financial records are hidden behind multiple shell corporations," he muttered, his eyes locked on the screen. "But there has to be a single access point, one account that controls them all." Eva leaned forward, studying the screen. "Adler isn't stupid. He wouldn't leave a paper trail." "No," Ethan agreed, "but he would leave a digital one. The trick wasn't finding the money. It was finding who moved it." And that's when Ethan saw it. A private offshore account, buried beneath layers of false identities, hidden within a bank, known for handling the kind of wealth that never made it onto tax forms. The name on the account wasn't Adler's. It wasn't even a corporation. It was something much simpler. A numbered code. But Ethan had seen enough accounts like this before to know what it meant. "This is it," he whispered. Eva frowned. "How do you know?" "Because this isn't just any account. This is an emergency fund." He turned the screen toward her. If Adler ever needed to vanish, this is where his money would be waiting. Eva's eyes widened. "So if we take this account, we take everything." Ethan nodded. "We don't just expose him. We bankrupt him, breaking in to break them down." But there was a problem. Adler's financial accounts weren't stored on some random server. They were hidden behind one of the most secure banking networks in the world, a system that required physical verification from one of Adler's devices to access, which meant Ethan needed to steal something from Adler himself. That's how they found themselves in the underground parking garage of Adler's private building hours later, watching as his sleek black luxury sedan pulled in. Adler stepped out, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He looked calm, collected, the same way he always did when he was untouchable. Ethan adjusted the gloves on his hands and took a slow breath. "You're sure about this?" Eva whispered. "Not even a little," Ethan admitted. Then he stepped forward. "Adler," he called. The older man paused mid-step, turning slightly, his cold gray eyes locking onto Ethan. "Graves," he said smoothly, barely hiding his irritation. "You're really starting to become a problem." Ethan smirked. "Good." Adler exhaled, waving off his security. "If you're here to beg for mercy, you're wasting your time." Ethan chuckled. "You think I'm here to negotiate?" Something in his voice must have tipped Adler off. He took a small step backward, but it was too late. Eva moved fast, snatching the phone from Adler's pocket before he even realized what was happening. The bodyguards reacted too slow. Ethan grabbed the first one, twisting his wrist and slamming his elbow into his ribs. The man crumpled. Eva stepped back, tossing the phone to Ethan as the second guard lunged, only for her to slam the car door into his face. Adler staggered back, his face finally showing the smallest flicker of fear. Ethan held up the stolen phone, his grin razor-sharp. Guess who just lost control of his money? Adler's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Ethan corrected. "I'm taking everything from you." And then he walked away. The final blow. The next 24 hours were a storm of chaos. With Adler's phone, Ethan was able to access his private account, not to steal the money, but to leak every transaction, every dirty deal, and every name connected to it to the authorities. By morning, it wasn't just Adler's empire that was burning. It was everyone who had ever worked with him. Judges, prosecutors, detectives, senators, CEOs. The entire system was collapsing in real time. Adler's arrest was broadcast live, the cameras flashing as he was led away in handcuffs. His face was blank, but Ethan knew what he was feeling. For the first time in his life, Adler had lost. Rebecca Carter's charges were dropped immediately. The truth about Simon Vance's murder finally exposed. She stepped out of prison into the sunlight, and the first thing she saw was Liam running toward her, his little face breaking into sobs as he threw himself into her arms. Ethan stood at a distance, watching. He had spent years defending the powerful, making sure men like Adler always walked free. Now he had made sure one of them never would again. Eva nudged his arm. "You did it." Ethan exhaled, staring at the chaos unfolding on the news. "Yeah," he murmured. "I did." And for the first time in his life, winning actually felt like it mattered. Epilogue. A new beginning. Ethan knew his career was over. There wasn't a single law firm in the country that would hire him now. He had burned every bridge, broken every unspoken rule of the game. And he didn't care. He had spent his entire life winning for the wrong people. Now, he was ready to start fighting for the right ones. As he walked down the street, leaving his old life behind, his phone buzzed. A new message. "Unknown number. I have a case for you. Someone who needs real help. Interested?" Ethan smirked. He didn't know who the message was from, but he already knew his answer. "Send me the details." And just like that, Ethan Graves, the man who once stood for nothing, was ready to fight for something real.